This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Unit 5, Wars and Expansion in the Early Human Societies in the Classical Era. At the very beginning of human societies, people lived in hunter-gatherer groupings. And as we've talked about before, these hunter-gatherer groupings were usually small groups, about 20 to 30 people. They saw themselves as part of an extended family. And so in these groups, wars tended to be over two different possibilities. One was either for finding resources, or the other is what we call an honor-shame society. Now, typically there have been two stereotypes about these early hunter-gatherer societies, and you can kind of see them as on opposite sides of the pole. One side of the pole is to look upon hunter-gatherer groups as based upon extreme violence. On the other side is the notion that they are noble savages and that they actually lived in peace. Well, both of these are incorrect, and both of them are kind of correct in a way. Here's how that's the case. Within these groups, the evidence seems to point that there was a good amount of peace, and that's because these groups were small. They were based upon this culture of seeing each other as extended families, and they kind of bonded together in order to find resources. However, between groups, there tended to be a lot of violence. Now, the violence that was there was probably not seen as much as we see in more modern times, but that's because these groups oftentimes didn't come into contact with each other. If they did, they tended to be very violent with each other because they saw each other as outsiders searching for resources. Early sedentary communities. Eventually, these hunter-gatherer groups, as we've talked about before, moved out of the African region into the Middle East, and as they did, they settled down into these sedentary communities, and they tended to form under two different types of economic systems. Either one was pastoral, meaning that they did animal husbandry, or the other was agricultural groups. We can actually kind of see some of these things as coming in some of our ancient literature. Like, for example, take the early literature, the Hebrew scriptures of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel are both brothers, but they do represent a possible representation of this early conflict that took place over resources, whether it was due to animal husbandry or if it was due to farming for farming surplus. Cain and Abel were two brothers, but they represented within the story these two different types of economic societies, animal husbandry and farming, and eventually they have a conflict in which one kills the other. So agricultural societies that settled down tended to form extended lineage systems and kinship systems. Originally, they did not have kings. They were run very similar to hunter-gatherer groups due to family relationships and family lineages. The lineages would incorporate the people who were conquered outside, and as they brought people in, these slaves eventually became a part of the family. So notice here that early types of warfare tended again to be over resources, and the way that people got defined then in these early warfare was conquered people used for gathering resources, and eventually they would just become a part of the family. Chiefdoms. Another type of society at the very beginning of this time period was run under what are called chiefdoms. Now, you might think of a chief as sort of like a king, but actually chiefs were not like kings. Now, how do we know this? Well, chiefs could not compel people to act. They didn't have laws, they didn't have military systems that would compel them. So how did they get people to do different types of activities? Well, what they would do is they would base their leadership upon charisma. Their charismatic personality would overwhelm people. Now, at times, this charismatic personality would have force behind it, or they might even form alliances with people within the tribe in order to do some type of force to get people to buy into this. But basically, it was based upon charismatic personality, not upon law, not upon military, not upon a justification based upon a religious system. Oftentimes, because they were big personalities, they were also known as the big man. Now, why does this matter in the long term? Well, societies would expand outwards and they conquered nature. They could then justify what they were doing as conquering human beings. And the big man then rose as a person who would do this as a king and monarch, and not just a chief. So sedentary societies and war. Humans, like we've talked about, moved out from Africa into the Middle East, and they moved next to Tigris and the Euphrates in order to seek out water. And that eventually led to states that were formed in order to provide irrigation projects that also protected private property. This then led to management systems, or what today we call bureaucracies, or governments. Governments had certain attributes that allowed them to do these kinds of bureaucratic managements, like collecting taxes, having written records, and having military enforcement. But now you need some kind of justification for this. Now remember, in the past, the justification was the big man, his personality, his charisma. But now, you needed more than that. You needed a way to organize people. And so now the big man got translated into a justification through law and sacred symbols. Now, that doesn't mean that the charisma of the big man was completely lost. In fact, that charisma would be very important going into the classical age. So don't think that there's a break so much between these ages as to see a consistency that's happening and just evolving over time. So wars continued to be over things like land and resources and control of water. Wars were about extraction of resources. But there was another system that was forming, an ideological system that was justifying who was doing this kind of extraction for resources. And that kind of justification was about these big men, these monarchs, who are now being justified through sacred symbols and through law. So now we get into some of these big land-based empires. And the first one is Persia. Persia would consolidate all these city-states in the Middle East, and it extended all the way out from the Hindu Kush in India through Central Asia and out into Egypt. The major kings of Persia included Cyrus and Darius. Now, they justified their leadership through the god Ahura Mazda. And this is where we start to see this move from the big man out into this notion of a justification through religion. I'll give you an example of this. At one point, one of these kings was caught by his advisors having an interesting affair or relationship in one of his rooms. And when that happened, the king turned around and actually had all the advisors who caught him in that relationship executed. Now, how did he justify this? He justified this through the laws of Ahura Mazda. Notice, we don't really see a break here. The king is still the big man, but the big man's personality is no longer just about charismatic personality. It is now being justified through a religious system. So this big man ruled through a central kingdom. However, as we've noticed with other kingdoms, the way that they did things was to have a central kingdom with local leadership. And so in this case, the Persians had this through a central kingdom and local, what were called satraps. Satraps are very similar to like local governors that we've seen in other types of systems. They also connected the empire through things like roads, bureaucracy, and tax collecting. So notice very similar to what we've seen in the past now as states are arising, states are trying to consolidate and creating connections. And wars became about land expansion. But notice too, what we've noticed here, there are two things happening. This is why we have to be so careful not to think it's only about one thing. Wars become about land expansion and resource extraction, very similar to the past. But notice what we're seeing arising here as time goes by. As we're reaching out and getting this land expansion, it's creating a separate tradition, a tradition of justification of the sacred monarch. And the sacred monarch is a continuation of the big man, but the big man here is being justified through religion and through law. The Greco-Persian Wars. So as Persia expanded outwards and conquered areas, it eventually, one of the areas it conquered was very close to the Greek peninsula, and they conquered a group of people called the Ionians, and the Ionians challenged the Persians over resources and land. Now as the Persians began to attack, the Greek states, like Athens and Sparta and the other Greek city-states, ended up siding with the Ionians. And this led to two major wars in which Persians lost at both. And the biggest battle that they lost was at the Battle of Marathon. Now, you might think that this had a dramatic, devastating problem for the Persians. It actually didn't. The Persians ignored the situation and continued ruling up until Alexander the Great. So this was not really a problem for the Persians. What it was an issue for was the Greek city-states. The Greek city-states ended up dividing over their leadership. After the war was all done, this was a golden age for Greece, but the city-states, because of their victory, started vying for leadership. Athens ended up leading a group called the Delian League, and they demanded that they should have leadership over the entire area. Sparta, which was not happy about this, eventually attacked Athens for leadership, and this led into the Peloponnesian War, which led to a Spartan win, but because the war was so devastating to the Greek city-states, and as they were attacking one another, a disease wiped through the area, it eventually led to a decline of the Greek city-states. Now, here we get sort of an interesting exception to the rule here. We don't really see a centralization here of like a land-based empire. And instead, we see city-states that have arisen. These city-states are kind of competing with each other for power, and we never see the rise of this one great monarch or one great big man to take over the area. So this is really a huge exception to the rule that we've seen so far in the classical age. Instead of seeing extraction of resources leading to a big man, instead we start to see these small city-states competing with each other. And remember that Athens was based overall on a democracy, although I would say it's much more of a democracy of the elite, and Sparta was based upon a militaristic society that also had a parliamentary system. So here we have an exception. The exception really is about a greater sense of like city-state competition, not centralized land-based empires. Now, why might this be the case? Well, one possibility might be the geography of the area. The geography of the area was a peninsula as well as very rocky mountains that made it very difficult to have any kind of centralized empire that would arise out of this. Instead, you just had a competition of small city-states based somewhat upon a democratic organization. However, that exception was to change. The change kind of leads us right back into the pattern that we've talked about before, and that is with the decline of these city-states, we have a big man who takes over, and that is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great took advantage of the decline of the Greek city-states. He took them over. He then organized and centralized them, spread out Hellenism and Greek influence going all the way out to India, and Alexander continued the charismatic leader role. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting. When Alexander died, his empire was probably the largest empire of that time period to spread out at any time. The Macedonian Empire spread all the way out to India, all the way back to what today we know as Italy and in Greece. This was the largest empire of its time, almost ended up conquering India. However, Alexander the Great makes a huge mistake that was made by these charismatic leaders over and over and over again. He never chose a leader to replace him. And because of that, when he died, and he died pretty early, he died in his 30s, when he died, his empire was split into three sections. The Seleucid, which is in the Persian area, today what would be known as Iran, the Ptolemaic, which is Egyptian, and the Indo-Greek. So because Alexander doesn't create some kind of lasting leadership to go on, his empire is going to be taken over as well, and that is by the Romans. Now, the Romans are an interesting group because when they began, the Romans really, if we go back in history, the Romans did not look like they were going to have much of a future. And the reason why is they started out as a small farming community in the Etruscan mountains. They did have a king. And they overthrew that king because they felt that the king was too corrupt. And this led into a fight that we talked about before between the patricians and the plebeians over land inequalities. The Romans eventually decided to solve that problem by expanding outwards, and as they did, they came into conflict with the Carthaginians and fought 3 Punic Wars for the expansion into northern Africa. Now, here's why this becomes so important for the issue of wars, and again, where we're going to see this tradition that we've talked about before, the rise of a big man justified by law and by religion, while at the same time looking for extraction of resources. And that's because military generals started to go out and conquer areas. And the way the Romans ran their system was that the military generals would attract soldiers by offering the lands that they won in battle. And eventually, these military generals were able to get the Senate in Rome to transfer power over to them. And that led to the competition of the generals between the triumvirates. Now, is there anything unique about Rome, though, that makes it different from what we've seen in the past? And I would argue, yes, there actually is. In the past, what we've seen is the rise of a big man or charismatic leader that would conquer and maintain control. Here what we have is a specific type of charismatic leader that's very specific to Rome, and that is the military general. The military general who's given emergency powers attracts soldiers by giving them what they want, which is the need for land, and then they are able to take over the Senate. That means Rome is in this constant rebuilding phase. It's in a constant phase to go out and try to expand and recreate itself and create itself as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that is going to be established over the entire world. And that's going to be very important for the difference between the West and what we're going to go to next, which is China. So in the case of China, again, we see a lot of similar patterns that we're going to see in the case of the West and the East as to why they fight wars, but there's going to be a major difference in the tradition and ideology. So just remember, the Shang created the idea of ancestor worship. The Chu justified a revolution that they had against the Shang through the mandate of heaven. Now, keep in mind what heaven meant for China. Heaven did not mean what we think of heaven here in the West. Heaven was an impersonal spiritual place that provided obligations. Now, I don't know if you're noticing here the tradition that's taking place here. Ancestor worship with obligations that are coming from an impersonal, transcendental spiritual place that's outside of the universe. This is going to be extremely important for what happens next. Right after this, we see the Chu fall apart into the era of the Warring States, and this establishes 2 main schools of philosophy, Confucianism and legalism. Now, here's why this becomes so important. Remember what we talked about with Rome. In the case of Rome, very similar to what we see in the other classical societies, the rise of the big man, justified by law, justified by religious traditions. But notice what happens in Rome that's a little bit different. Military generals who are constantly going out and recreating the Roman identity. Whereas in China, there's a difference. In the Chinese tradition, coming out of ancestor worship, coming out of the mandate of heaven, and now with these 2 major philosophies trying to organize the states, we again see a big man, we see a charismatic leader who's justified by religion, justified by law. But the purpose is to maintain or restore old wisdom traditions and institutions. In other words, Rome is much more about recreating. China is much more about restoring. And that's going to be important long term for understanding the difference in the traditions that are established in West and East. And that, of course, leads us to the first major empire after this major period of war that takes place in which everything has fallen apart in China, and that is the Qin dynasty. The Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi established a centralized power in which he imprisoned and killed all opposing scholars to his system. He then centralized things under common roads, common measurements, and strong governance. Now notice here, very similar to what we talked about early on in these societies, you have a strong emperor who is organizing everything, making sure that he has the charisma and the strong centralized control over this area. He also built a great wall to protect against the northern steppe invaders. And just like Alexander the Great, when he died, he had not set up a leader to continue after him, so that opened up a vacuum of power. So what are some of the conclusions that we can make about early warfare at this time period? Well, I think the first thing that we can say is that very early warfare tended to be about resource extraction and the shame and honor of a leader. In other words, most of the warfare that took place during the hunter-gatherer periods and then the early sedentary periods was about getting resources like land and water and food supplies. But it also could be about the shame and honor of the leader. If a leader was somehow shamed, it was up to his community to uphold the honor of that leader to make sure that they were seen as respectable. Once we start to see land-based empires, those land-based empires also about the extraction of resources and tribute. But at the same time that we see a material basis to why we're fighting wars, we also see an ideological basis. And the ideological basis seems to be a justification based upon sacred authority in the law of these big men or monarchs. So while resources are really important, I think it's important for us not to lose sight of how important ideology is as well in fighting in wars. Contrasting ideologies. So while it is very important to point out some of the commonalities, I think it's also important to point out some of the differences between these societies. Definitely, there are definite similarities between these societies when we think of how Rome and China were establishing empires to get resource extraction. They were also trying to uphold the honor of their big men who were then justified off of law and about sacred traditions. However, there are also some major differences. Roman ideology seems to be rooted within military leaders, and so it's about constantly recreating. Whereas in the case of China, the wars seem to be about upholding tradition and wisdom. The major Chinese conflict seems to be a fight between emperors and nobles, and so to try to uphold tradition, uphold wisdom, going all the way back to the Shang and the Chu, the way that this was done was to create a system of educated bureaucracies, in which in order to get into these bureaucracies, you had to show merit, and you did that through the civil service exam. But notice here that in some ways you could say that the Chinese system is more what we might call conservative or traditional, in the sense that wars are really fought over trying to maintain the honor of the leader who is in charge. And finally, war and decline. Why do we eventually see the decline of these empires? Well, there are different possibilities. One might be that the empires overextended in their imperial land grabs, and that eventually caused multiple problems. One was, how do you keep these areas defended? The other problem is, how do you pay for this? And the way they tried to pay for this was to tax, and you can't tax the nobles too much, so the taxes tended to fall on the peasants. The other problem had to do with outside groups. As you expanded outwards, a lot of these empires tend to come into conflict with other groups, and sometimes, like in the case of the Romans with the Carthaginians, they were able to defeat them, but in other times, where we see like with the steppe invaders, eventually the steppe invaders conquer these societies as they come in over a long period of time.